everybody. Today is Thursday, February 4th, 2021. Welcome to the school committee meeting. Happy to see everybody here. I'm calling this meeting to order at this time, and we're going to start with attendance. Maya Plotkin.
Here.
Charlie Donahue.
Here.
Tony Mullen.
Here.
Amanda Phillips.
Here.
Excellent. We are all here. Before we get started, I want to recognize that this is a live broadcast. That online stream is available through Westwood Media Center and also online at westwood.k12.ma.us/live. And this is to provide real-time public access to the activities of the school committee in accordance with the March 12th, 2020 Executive Order of Governor Baker. Coming up on a year, hard to believe, but so it is. So this is a very important meeting for all of us, fellow members of the school committee, and for the administration, as this meeting is a special meeting specifically to hear the proposed 2022 budget. This meeting is dedicated to one of our three main responsibilities as school committee members. As you all know, we are responsible for policies, we're responsible for hiring the superintendent, and we are responsible for the budget. So tonight is a special budget meeting. And after tonight's meeting, in accordance with the law, we will have a meeting that's devoted, basically a public hearing on the budget. And that is when the public will have opportunity to participate. And then at some point following that, we will deliberate and we will vote on the budget. And as you know, this is one piece of the budget puzzle for the entire town. It's a big piece. It's an important piece. So we appreciate all the work that Emily and her team has done and continues to do to pull this budget together. So without further ado, we're going to move on to the discussion item, which is the presentation of the superintendent's recommended FY22 operating budget and capital budget. Emily, the floor is yours.
All right. Thanks, Carol. Hello, everyone. Good evening. So I'm going to kick off the presentation, and then we're going to be kind of tag teaming different slides here as we go through this evening. We've got a lot to cover, so we're going to try to move through the slides fairly efficiently, but obviously we're happy to answer questions as they arise. So let me just share my screen. And all right, can we all see this? All set?
All set.
All right, great. All right, so I'm pleased to present the superintendent's recommended FY22 budget to you tonight. We're going to start very quickly just with a little FY21 context because I think it sets the stage for tonight. Then we'll move into the operating budget, looking at our FY22 proposal, and then also sort of foreshadowing and looking ahead to some upcoming budget cycles. And then we'll move into the capital budget, which Lemma will present the FY22 proposal. And as part of that, we do want to have a brief discussion about longer term issues related to elementary facilities. So that's the plan. So first, just a quick review about FY21. And these are things that we have discussed previously this year, but just want to remind the public that clearly this has been a very different kind of year for us, and we have incurred many expenses that we hadn't anticipated when the FY21 budget was originally approved. And so our COVID expenses to date have been about $1.9 million. My animations are a little funky here. So you can see the categories, and we've talked about these in the past. So technology, operations around things like PPE, disinfecting supplies, filters for our HVAC system, issues related to student services for earlier intervention. Obviously, we are employing a nurse to deal with our COVID issues, to lead our COVID team, and then a host of other expenses. At the same time that we've had some additional expenses, we've also seen reduced revenue. To date, about $250,000. So we did negotiate a savings to our transportation contract because we aren't using the buses as frequently as we would in a normal year. But at the same time, our bus revenue has been reduced because our ridership isn't as high as it was pre-COVID. In food services, we have been experiencing a loss as well. Unfortunately, our sales just are not as high as usually would be the case. As you recall, we did make some significant layoffs in food service staff for this year, but there is sort of a baseline number of folks that we need, whether we're serving, 10 meals in a school or we're serving 100 meals in a school. We do have to staff the operation. So we are looking at that. So despite a 53% reduction in staff, we've had a net loss of over $100,000 to date. And then, of course, we aren't running extended day. And therefore, the offset that we have in our budget from extended day is something that we will have to deal with. Although our extended day revenue does serve to offset some of our transportation and custodial expenses in a typical year, in reality, there wasn't a viable way to actually make a reduction in those areas to say cut a bus or cut a custodian. And so sort of left with this problem. But the good news is that we've been able to address these issues. So I think we made some smart choices back in the spring and in the summer when we decided to sort of carve out some space in the FY21 budget by not filling some positions that we thought we were going to have. That has amounted to about $650,000. We've talked about those positions before. We did get an additional $225 per student, about $675,000 from the state for COVID-related expenses. And then the town of Westwood has been very supportive in working with us to charge $750,000, more or less, to the town's CARES Act funding and or to submit for FEMA reimbursement. So the good news is that despite sort of net over a $2 million unanticipated, COVID-related expenses and revenue loss, we are on track to close the FY21 budget on June 30th without having to take further stabilization measures. So hopefully we're going to land the plane successfully here at the end of the year. So now we're turning our attention to FY22, and we have made some budget assumptions. So the first assumption is that students have returned to full in-person instruction. The FY22 budget is built for sort of a regular school year. We are assuming that federal entitlement grants will be level funded. We're assuming that Chapter 70 will be level funded, and the word coming out of the state at this point is that is a fair assumption. In fact, it looks like there might even be a small increase. We're assuming that circuit breaker will be funded at 70%, and we haven't heard anything coming out of the state that would suggest otherwise at this point. And we're assuming that our fee-based offsets will return to FY20 levels. So with those assumptions, as cost center leaders have been providing input to develop the budget, and as the district leadership team has been really thinking about what we need to do for next year, we have realized that what we need to do is focus on recovery and stabilization. We've been in this very disrupted year. We had disruption last spring. And so we think what we're going to need to do is address the impact of that disruption and get things back on track. And so the themes for the FY22 budget are really this. We focused a great deal on our ability to provide academic support and intervention, to provide mental health support as we're sort of transitioning out of this very disrupted period, and then also to return to some strategic priorities that have had to take a back seat as we've just been managing our way through the pandemic. So I think what you'll see is that the requests and the decisions that we've made in the budget reflect these needs and these ideas. The good news is that in the last two budget cycles, we actually included some positions that were related to our strategic priorities that in fact provide a strong foundation for the needs that I just talked about. So over the last 2 years, we did add ELA specialist at the middle school. We added a middle school guidance counselor, a high school guidance counselor, a pre-K to 8 social emotional learning coordinator. And those positions will be really important as we think about some of the work going forward. So here's a look at the overall proposed budget. And you can see that our proposed budget represents a 3.4% increase over FY21. To put that in context a bit, so you can see here the operating budget increases over the last several years. And we've talked about, we've seen a similar chart many years running here. Back in FY16 and FY17, we had some pretty significant increases that were due to increased revenue to the town resulting from the new growth at University Station. And so those budgets have been really important in terms of establishing kind of a solid foundation for us to be building. And since that time, the last few years, we've gotten into this, pretty steady rhythm where each year we have been able to provide a budget that is, a little more than 3% in terms of its increase. You can see that last year, I think we had a moment where we said, this is going 3.3, 3.4, 3.5, 3.6, is that a trajectory? But you can see here in FY22, we're back down to 3.4%. And just a reminder, I think we are aware of this, but schools and school budgets, therefore, are largely about people. And that's important to understand for the big picture of the budget, that the salaries comprise 86.7% of the budget. And it's important to keep that in mind. One of the first things that we have to do when developing the budget is to think about what are our contractual obligations in terms of our personnel. And we look at what it would take basically to open again in the fall with the people that we have currently employed in the district. So that accounts for a big chunk of the proposed budget. Here you can see the major budget broken down by categories, and this really reflects what was just on the last slide. So total salaries here, the incremental change is nearly $1.3 million. It's a 3% increase. I do just want to point out, in case you can remember back to FY21, we had a similar chart, and in FY21, this incremental change was actually about 4.5%, which we said at the time we thought was a bit of an anomaly related to a couple of things. We'd moved some things from contracted services to actual employees. And we also made an adjustment in how we budget, where we're getting information earlier about people who are making lane changes. And so I'm pleased to see that that incremental change is back down to where we would expect it to be. On this chart, I think the number that leaps out is the 19% incremental change in special ed, and we can talk more about that in a bit, but basically what this represents is an investment that we need to make in contracted services to address short-term student needs. And so we've increased that particular line item by $85,000. In addition to that, we are budgeting for a 3% increase in special ed tuitions, out-of-district tuitions, and transportation. And these are things that we are very confident will happen because they're based on contractual increases and state rates. So as we move into general education, first thing I wanted to talk about is to think a little bit about enrollment. And if you're following along in your budget book, this line chart is actually slightly different than the one that was in the book. I shifted the years because I thought it would be helpful to project out a little more. So we've talked about enrollment trends a lot over the last few years. And what we notice is that the overall enrollment, and if we could look at this over 20 years, we would really see that kind of this enrollment just kind of hovers around 3,000. And in a given year, there isn't really that much of a swing. But what's interesting to look at, and is particularly important when we're budgeting, is to see where the enrollment is. So to look at how students are distributed across the levels. And so for a number of years, we were talking about increases at the secondary level. First, there was sort of an enrollment bubble moving through the middle school, and then it arrived at the high school. And during that same period of time, the elementary enrollment was declining. And so what we're seeing now in our projections is that the enrollment bubble is kind of making its way. The enrollment at the high school is crested. The secondary enrollment is starting to decline and is projected to decline for the next few years, whereas the elementary enrollment is projected to start going up again. So the enrollment by level, just to look at a year-over-year comparison. So this elementary number is interesting. I will say that I put an asterisk here for the projection for elementary. The enrollment projection reports that we have actually show this higher. So I think that this is likely a bit low, but it represents what we can see right now. So kids who are currently in our classrooms, and then taking a look at census information about incoming kindergartners. This number does tend to increase a bit over the summer. You know, people move to town when their kids are about to start school, or, you know, sometimes we see fluctuation from people moving in to town for other reasons. So I think that will likely go up a little bit at this point.
Emily, do we know how many students we think we lost to private schools that weren't, well, new private school people, you know what I mean? That
I do know. Yeah, I do know what you mean. So we, you know, I don't have those numbers off the top of my head. I will tell you that I did review it, and we did not see the kind of exodus that some other districts did.
Okay.
And so it really was not a very dramatic difference for us. You know, I know there's been concern about that at the state level. Across the state, public school enrollment is down 3% this year. We did not experience that. You know, there is some question about whether or not people held their kids back from kindergarten this year. So we'll have to see how that all plays out. So I do expect that to be higher. Middle school, you can see really not much change at all. High school is starting to decline. And that, I think, is actually the important thing to think about for this particular budget. So if we take a look at the high school enrollment, and you can see that here on the y-axis, it starts at 700, right? You know, what you notice is this is what we were talking about, that the enrollment at the high school has been increasing. And over this period of time in our budget cycles, we've staffed up at the high school, right? Sometimes by reallocating from elementary when the elementary enrollment was declining. And so we've crested and we're starting to decline. And you can see it's going to decline quite a bit more by 22, 23. And this is important because in the FY21 budget, you see that it wasn't that big a decline this year. We really didn't take cuts in staff at the high school. You need to get to the point where it incrementally makes sense to cut a position. And so in the FY21 approved budget, we didn't take that step. But then when we had to make changes due to COVID, as you know, we did decide that we would eliminate, I think, 5.6 positions at the high school. And so one of the questions we've been asking ourselves in this budget development is, those positions are in the budget but are vacant. What was the impact of that in terms of class size and program offerings? And can we sustain those cuts so that we can reallocate that FTE to other areas that are in line with what we think the priorities are this year? And I think it's important to note that, you know, we're asking, are we going to bring back positions that we believe we would probably be cutting in a year again? And based on that analysis, we think that almost all of the cuts that we made this year are in fact sustainable. And so that is part of our strategy for the FY22 budget. And I just want to emphasize this because I think it could potentially seem like that's a lot of cuts at the high school, and are we sort of decimating the program? And I want to assure people that we've looked at this, and the impact we think is very reasonable. Class sizes will be reasonable. We have noted some interesting shifts in students' elective choices, and so there are some places that we've taken some cuts there. So here is how the FY22 proposed budget is built. So we start with the FY21 budget here to understand the increase. As I mentioned, we have an increase in salary for existing personnel that is about meeting our contractual obligations. And then what you can see is what I was just describing, that we really have decided that we're going to reallocate staff based on where we see enrollment and also based on our priorities. And so we are proposing 7.9 FTE positions to address those issues around intervention, mental health, some of our strategic priorities. And these positions are not new cuts. They represent cuts that we already made in FY21, but we need to memorialize them in the budget because they had been included in the FY21 budget. We made those shifts when we realized we were going to be in a different model. We're also recommending 4.9 FTE support staff positions. We have some increase to various non-salary accounts. And I'm confused why I have 1.5 FTE there. I'll have to think about that. And given that that's non-salary, I think that's just a typo. Apologies. Anyway, the bottom line here is that the total change we can see is 1.655845 for our recommended budget of just over $50 million. So we want to take a look at what the positions are. Our first recommendation is that we increase elementary general education staffing by 3 FTE. And this is for a couple of reasons. So, first I'll start by reminding people, I know the committee is well aware that small elementary schools pose a challenge for hitting our school committee class size guidelines, that the addition or subtraction of a very, a very small number of kids at a particular school can then change the number of class sections that are required. And so that's just a challenge that we have every year. And sometimes then we have to make less than ideal choices because the numbers don't come out quite the way that we wish they would come out. But we've really decided that a goal for FY22 is to keep class sizes at the elementary within or even lower than guidelines. And I say even lower than, because again, sometimes when you're making that choice about whether we're going to go with 1 large section or 2 smaller sections, the result is you end up with 2 sections that are below the guideline. But we think that given the disruption of this year, that keeping our class sizes small would facilitate what we refer to as tier 1 interventions, things that take place within the general education context. So that is part of our plan.
Emily?
Yes.
Thank you. As you're doing this, I don't know if this is possible, but it would be very helpful to identify how many of these changes were long coming, you've thought of for a while, and how many are aimed at recovering from the pandemic, COVID-19? How many are trying to make up for lost education, lost things? If you could maybe make that distinction, if it's possible, it would be very interesting to see how much is recovery versus how much just makes sense looking at the numbers.
Yes. Yeah, I understand the question. So, I would say that sort of hearkening back to some prior comments, the reductions, I think, were things that were already on the horizon, just in terms of some of the things that are happening with enrollment at the high school. The additions, I would say that the bulk, if not all of them, and I will check as I go through the presentation, are related to this idea of recovery. So I've put up some enrollment projections for next year for elementary class sizes, and I want to emphasize that this represents a likely scenario given the current projections that we have, but that in the budget, we would wait to assign the FTEs until later because the numbers at each school could change, right? So this is just an example, though, of what we think the impact of adding the 3 FTEs would be. And you can see here that we end up with class sizes that are all within the school committee guidelines, right? All of them are within guidelines. And in fact, where we've had to make some tough choices, we've made them. So, if you look at these numbers at Deerfield right now, grade 2 is projected to be 25, right? You could have a section of 25. We've broken it. Grade 3 is 28. We've broken that into 2. Hanlon, grade 2, 27. We've broken it into 2. So we've made those decisions deliberately. The numbers at Deerfield do look particularly small. Our plan would be that when we get enrollment, typically over the summer, for students who are in the buffer zone, you remember that students in the buffer zone at University Ave are assigned either to Deerfield, Downey, or Hanlon. Based on these projections, the plan would be to assign them to Deerfield because we sort of have the most room there. So this is what it would look like. We particularly focused actually on grade 5. And let me just sort of show you a contrast. So this is what the chart might look like without the addition of 3 FTE. So if we had to remove 3 positions, we said, well, where would we remove them? And what you notice here is these 2 grade 5s. Those are in fact within the school committee guideline for grade 5. So in a typical year, we would go with those numbers. But given the experience that we've had during the pandemic, we think that it would make sense to split these into 3 sections for next year. Similarly, you might just call that a singleton at Deerfield, but we think it may make sense to split that this year.
So Emily,
Yeah.
excuse me, I guess a couple of questions. So I guess one observation is right now the kindergarten numbers for change actually look like we've landed pretty good for now. It's now, which is good news. But I guess the question I had was, is the intent, let's say, I'm making this up, there was all of a sudden you got first grade and down, 8 kids moved in. I'm just making that up. Is the intent that you would cap it at the 3, or would you think about a 4th as an example?
Would I add another position? Is that what you're
so is the 3 basically we're adding 3, that's our recommendation, but we'll decide later, or
Well, my recommendation is to add 3. I mean, and as I said, I've sort of hypothetically applied them.
Right. Okay.
Right. But we would want to see where the numbers fall. I guess I would say that this year, like every year, sometimes we have things that happen over the summer and we just have to make new decisions at that point. And so, in the kind of scenario that you described, I might be coming back to the school committee in the summer to say, I think we need to consider adding another FTE. And, at that point, we would have some sense of turnover numbers and, things like that. Does that answer what you're getting at?
Yeah, I guess a little bit. I mean, I guess another way to look at it is to say we're only going to do 3, and we know
start with 4.
Grade 5 is all. No, you start with 3, and that's 3, and grade 5 is already in guideline. I guess you can cap it at 3 theoretically and say this is what our best guess is. But you answered my question though.
Okay. All right. So actually, I'm going to turn it over to Allison here. She's going to talk about the other elementary positions.
Great, thank you. And this, I think these positions definitely fall in that bucket of recovery. So, one thing that we've put on the table is to increase our elementary math specialist allotment, and this actually brings our math specialist FTE to be parallel to our literacy. And this is just with an eye to providing more intervention. We're particularly thinking about grades 3, 4, and 5 next year as grades that we think may have been impacted. And we want to make sure those foundational skills are really solid as kids move through their elementary grades. This allotment would allow for 1 full-time specialist at each of the smaller schools, Deerfield and Hanlon, and then 1.5 at the larger schools. And then the next thing is, this is an interesting proposal, and essentially what it does is it adds hours to the kindergarten assistant role and then provides some sort of a little bit of a restructuring of the role. It's not to say that those people are going to get pulled out of kindergarten automatically or all day long, but what we wanted to do was to increase the flexibility with that position to sort of deploy people really strategically where they're needed. We understand there may be some real needs in kindergarten around SEL support and things like that, but there also might be times when these folks can then move into other grade levels and help be another person providing a group for intervention programming. So at the middle school, there's kind of some similar things going on in terms of a real focus on intervention. If you recall, in FY21, we added a part-time literacy position to support some intervention there. We're looking to do some similar work in math. And again, we're thinking a lot about sort of the kids who this year are in grades 3, 4, and 5, the 5th graders moving up to the middle school. We want to make sure that we're really providing extra help as needed for kids who might have gaps because of the disruptions of the last year. And these are the kind of gaps where you can't fill them in necessarily easily in the context of the classroom. So the specialists, these interventionists, both on the literacy and the math side, would be working under the direction of the department heads, but they'd be working primarily with students throughout their work week. In addition, and this one is interesting, in order to make an intervention program run really well, you need to have some leadership, somebody to sort of oversee the assessment, analyze results, make sure we're kind of identifying students appropriately, make sure we're kind of progress monitoring. And the middle school has proposed to increase our current department heads. So in addition to the work they traditionally do around curriculum and around supervision and evaluation of staff in those departments, they would also be really kind of taking a lead role in developing a more robust intervention program.
So Allison, this position, the department heads of the middle school, they don't actually teach classes, it's purely administrative.
It is purely administrative, although, you know, sometimes their function is to go in and kind of teach alongside or model lessons for staff in their departments.
And I just want to clarify, Carol, that the model we have for department heads at the middle school is different from the high school, that each of these 2 department heads are responsible for 2 departments.
Okay.
So we have math and science, and then we have ELA and social studies.
Got it.
This kind of creates a hybrid a little bit between the elementary and the high school model. So we still have that 0.4 kind of department leadership role similarly to the high school, but we're adding on some additional FTE to allow us to sort of bring in the best of what the elementary does too.
Okay,
sorry, can I go back to that position?
Yeah.
I know, you know, last meeting we talked about looking at curriculum in terms of, you know, trying to, in the inclusive effort that we have. It doesn't seem like curriculum or reviewing curriculum is under the purview of these department heads. Is that right?
I mean, I would say a big part of what they do, they're charged with implementing, being leaders in a leadership role in terms of implementing recommendations at their level. So we've got high school department heads, middle school department heads, and then the elementary coordinators. In the wake of any curriculum review we have specific recommendations that roll out, and we meet vertically as a team to talk about and kind of work on planning strategically when and how to get those things done.
But I think what you're asking, may I correct me if I'm wrong? I mean, they are the curriculum leaders for the department.
Yes.
Right,
so
that was right.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
that's the
they are.
question.
Yes,
Okay.
they are. And so their current 0.8 is curriculum, leadership, supervision, and evaluation.
Okay.
And we're proposing to increase them to full-time because we want to add this intervention piece.
I see. So these bullets, the expanded role and the training of the staff, that's all new to accommodate for the 0.2 increase.
Yes.
In addition to what they're currently doing.
Correct.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Now
So
I understand.
Yes.
I thought that was their...
This is about intervention programming.
Okay. Got
Yeah.
it. Thank you.
Okay, I think Abby's going to talk about this.
Sure. So what I think is most important to consider in this request is the idea that our middle school therapeutic program currently meets the needs of many students, but is slated to meet the needs of more students next year. And we anticipate, as part of the recovery process, that we may have additional referrals, specifically at middle school and for this program. So this request is to build out a second teacher to the therapeutic program at the middle school. Particularly, it's built to parallel the idea of the flex program at the high school. So as you guys know, we have a very successful model at the high school where we have 2 special ed teachers who split the caseload of the 20 or so students at the high school program. And the idea here at the middle school is to provide a second teacher to do a similar approach for approximately 15 students next year. So it's a lower number than at the high school, but that makes sense because it's only 3 grades and not 4. And the idea really is that we're trying to proactively build the infrastructure to support students in district. We feel like kids, particularly kids who are vulnerable, have had a lot of disruption in the last 15 months. And our goal really is to provide continuity with the teachers, their friends, their home community, and the school climate to basically allow them to stay in the district. So this is a request that Charlie does speak to the recovery piece of this budget, but is also good practice if we think about just building a pipeline as we go through into the high school model. So that is a 1.0 teacher request.
You may recall that in the, was it just the last budget? I think the last budget, we did a similar, we made a similar addition to the STAR program, which is the elementary school version of it. And so I think that's important. We were seeing increased numbers at the elementary level, and now we need to be ready to receive them at the middle school. And then at the high school, that's a lot of text. I'll try to break it down here. We are looking to add 2 FTE high school academic support. And so these are 2 slightly different positions. So one position will oversee the academic support class, which we refer to as ASK at the high school. And ASK is a general education support that we have in place for students who perhaps are not on an IEP, but who need some additional academic support. And so we've had it in place for a long time. It has historically been staffed, though, kind of piecemeal as part of the teacher supervisory structure. And what that means is there's a teacher that's assigned to staff this duty every block of the day, but who it is changes from period to period and day to day. And so if we're looking for silver linings or things that we've learned during the pandemic, this year, we actually, for a number of reasons, were able to have one person oversee the program. And what we learned is that really just works better. And so it just provides continuity for students and for families and for communicating with the gen ed teachers. So we think that it's been more effective, and we want to keep with that model. The other piece of it that's very important as we think about intervention is that the result of that will be that rather than assigning teachers to this ask duty, now they're available to do other things that we have teachers do when they're not teaching. And specifically, it will provide more teacher time for substantive content-specific assistance. We'll be able to provide more support in the math seminar, more support in the writing lab. So this is part of the overall intervention strategy at the high school. The second academic support position is to add a person who would serve as the METCO academic advisor. This is the model that we have in place at the middle school, where we have someone who provides that support directly working with students. And we haven't had a similar structure at the high school. We would like to add that in. We think it will be better for students, provide more continuity in their experience. The other piece, so that's very important, is that with an individual who's dedicated to working directly with students throughout the day, it will create sort of more capacity for our METCO director, Latifa Frank, to do other leadership work that we think we would really benefit from, and that's related to our strategic priorities. When we brought Latifa on board, we did make her part of the administrative council, which is the leadership team, the pre-K to 12 leadership team for the district. And, we would like her to have more capacity to guide the district's diversity, equity, and integration work. And this would allow for that. And we also are thinking a bit, and we'll talk more about this later on, about the potential expansion of METCO to the elementary grades. And so this would be sort of a foundational piece of being able to have her do that kind of work. I should note that we did get an increase in our METCO grant funding from the state. And so we think approximately half of this position can be offset by the increase in the grant.
Emily, at some time future meeting, would it be possible to maybe have Latifa talk to us about, has the recovery been more difficult for Metro students in what they've been going through than everyone else? Are there any unique things that we should be sensitive to and aware of?
Yeah, I think that's great. I can have her speak to that. And, I will say that we have, I think, a higher proportion of our Boston students who are fully remote this year as compared to Westwood residents. And so, we're thinking about that transition back next year. All right, and then student services position. So I'm going to turn it back over to Abby for this too.
Great. So in the student services department, we have a couple of requests, and the first that I want to talk about is a 0.3 addition to the school psychologist position at Hanlon. And I kind of want to caveat it by saying, while we're identifying it to be at Hanlon, and Sarah is a very good advocate for the Hanlon school community, I do see this as a broader intervention that will support all 5 elementary schools. So what's important to understand is that currently Hanlon has a 0.7 FTE, part-time school psychologist. And as you guys know, in our model, we don't have school adjustment counselors at elementary. We, a long time ago, determined that we would put all of our FTE into the school psychologist role. So we have full-time school psychologists in very small schools. And that's purposeful because a school psychologist can both provide counseling and support as well as do testing. So for a smaller community with a smaller population set of elementary schools, that was a wise choice, a long time ago. I'd say that as a recovery response for this coming year, it's very important that we've gotten the input of the principals, K-12, and we really do think that there's a mental health investment to be made across the district. So what we're proposing here is a 0.3 increase, which would bring the current 0.7 psychologist at Hanlon up to full-time. That has the immediate benefit to Hanlon of providing a 5-day-a-week full-time staff member in the building, because you can almost always guarantee that a significant event will happen during the little bit of time that the person is not in the building. And that will respond to that concern for the Hanlon community, but also that person will be available to the entire K-5 school community to provide additional intervention. And I'm envisioning it really as a testing support to all the psychologists at the 5 elementary schools, to allow the people who really know the kids and the families in the elementary schools to be more available for counseling and family outreach and support, particularly next year. So that is the request specifically to the Hanlon 0.3.
Can I ask you a quick question about that, Abby?
Yep.
So all of the other elementary schools have a full-time psychologist, correct?
Correct.
So if the Hanlon full-time psychologist is shared as a testing resource across the district, then does that mean that the Hanlon students would have less access to a psychologist if the psychologist is testing at another school? I'm not understanding why, it's a shared resource and not a dedicated resource.
Well, because, broadly speaking, the Hanlon school population that hovers right below 200 students, right at 200, normally you wouldn't need a full-time school psychologist for that student load. So for example, at Hanlon, they might have 28 students on IEPs, right? A third of whom need to be tested every year. So you're looking at a lower testing load overall. What I would say is that we have a really good track record of collaboratively and professionally sharing people when needed, and keeping them where they need to be when they're needed. So I would say that both Deerfield and Hanlon are places that are smaller schools from a population perspective, but have been very generous with sharing psychologist FTE to other buildings, but also when they need it, and their colleagues respect that. So I feel pretty confident that we can manage it successfully to meet both needs, Amanda. And I think, the increase would be a welcome support to the Hanlon community, and it would be an overall benefit.
Now, is the Deerfield the same situation? Because it's about the size of Hanlon.
But I was wondering.
And that's a good observation. So if we look at the October 1 data for Deerfield, they had 191 students with a full-time school psychologist. We want to remember that they do house a specialized program for the district, so that changes that analysis a little bit. But we looked at their IEP numbers. They had about 36 IEPs, whereas Hanlon had about 28. So even there is a somewhat, ratioed differential to account for that FTE difference. But, talking to Josh and Sarah, I think they are very open to collaborating with the other principals. And I think this would be a net benefit to the whole system.
I'm just going to add that for me, I like the idea of having the full-time psychologist dedicated to Hanlon, because as Abby kind of alluded to, I mean, you can't plan always the moments that you're really going to need that support. And so I think having somebody who's, 5 days a week in the building just provides, some needed capacity. This other position though, and I think we may be conflating things a bit, so I just want to clarify, we're also proposing that we add one FTE psychologist that would by design be a district-wide position. And the way that we're envisioning this is that that person would be utilized to do the evaluation and testing support across the district. The idea being that we can reduce the testing load for all of our school-based psychologists, because what we want them to do is focus on in-school counseling, whole class social emotional support, family and community outreach. And so it's sort of shifting the proportion of how they're spending their time in the direction of counseling. And so this is, I think, an important plan for us. We're imagining that this addition of this 1.0 psychologist that would really be utilized for testing is a short-term intervention, maybe 1 to 2 years as we transition out of the pandemic. And, so that's kind of how we're conceiving of the position. It's easier to bring somebody in to do district-wide testing because we want to keep the school-based psychologists who know the kids, who know the families doing the counseling.
Yep.
If that makes sense.
So I think the 1.0 school psychologist for the district makes a lot of sense. And I like the idea of increasing the Hanlon psychologist to a full-time position. I'm trying to understand. So with this change, all 5 elementary schools would have a full-time school psychologist. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
Is Hanlon the only one that would be a shared resource among the 5 schools?
Yep.
Okay.
I have to say they're a department though. So as
right. So that's
help each other. So if you think of mutual aid in this idea, so we frequently kind of share resources across the school system when needed. I think that the intention here is to attend to the elementary school needs, which are real, as well as this larger idea about testing. And, certainly if for any reason Hanlon continued to need just that support dedicated to them, we would respond to that as well.
Right. So presumably, if I understand that sort of Hanlon has a lesser need at this time and can afford the sharing, but presumably if that shifted, you would then reallocate the resources.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. And to Abby's point, we do that already. So, you know, I mean, for example, the psychologist at Deerfield may pick up a couple of extra testing, you know, assignments from another district. And so we're sort of constantly looking at that issue.
Can you, everybody seems to be, you know, talking about the needs and, you know, we have a psychologist in each school. Just to give us a better understanding, can you tell us, not necessarily a day in the life, but can you give us a little more of the nitty gritty of, you know, you said they do in-school counseling and social and emotional support. Can you tell us a little more of what that looks like?
Yep, absolutely. So I think that what you have to understand is that in this day and age, school psychologists aren't just sitting in an office alone like we may remember them doing. So a school psychologist may be greeting students at the front door and welcoming an anxious student in the morning, co-leading a morning meeting with a general ed teacher, offering 2 different lunch bunches, and then following up with individual students in appointments throughout the day, and then testing somebody and writing up their report at night. And that those kind of services flow through a school day flexibly. So we certainly see, for example, that school psychologists are present on the crisis teams of schools. They're present often on the leadership teams of schools. They sometimes are the teacher in charge of the principals out of the building for a meeting. And certainly next year and into the future, you know, we have a pre-referral or a child study team process where a new referral comes in, and school psychologists are very active in all of those things. And that's all in addition to testing. So many things, to be honest with you.
And Abby, correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it too, is that the school psychologist in Westwood in our district is available to general education students, and that's not the case in all districts. Is that correct?
That's very correct. And we're really proud of that.
Right. And I think that should be emphasized because I think that's a big advantage that Westwood is able to offer its students.
Yeah.
I had a question. Oh, go ahead. Along those same lines and like access to general ed students, if there was something more we could work in to support that grouping, obviously psychologists, especially like in the case of the Hanlon, if she's out testing or, you know, if she's pulled elsewhere, it just seems like the psychologists spend most of their time, rightfully so, working with kids that are part of the special education program, which makes perfect sense. I just wonder if, you know, there isn't a place for like almost like a social worker type role that could provide more of the like boots on the ground, working on some of the SEL needs with students that aren't on IEPs. You know, I get the sense even before the pandemic, I was hearing from parents about SEL concerns, about this kind of like, you know, idea that kids are more anxious than they were before. They may not be on an IEP, but they need some help. And I would think also coming out of the pandemic, we're almost going to have like double transition years in some cases, right? So I wonder if there wouldn't be a way, you know, to incorporate a social worker. It might be a little bit more cost effective, and maybe that person could, you know, possibly pick up some of the gap if there is a gap at the Hanlon.
Great. We're happy to go back and look at that. I think school psychologists are great utility players in that way, to be honest with you. And we can certainly think more about that.
I don't doubt that. This would be like an addition in my, you know, perfect world, in addition to the extra school psychologist.
Yeah. I do think so. I will say, Amanda, because I'm really thinking about what you're saying. I think it parallels some conversations that we had about this. So that's good to hear, because we really were saying, how do we sort of carve out more time for the school-based psychologist to be doing exactly the kind of work that you're talking about. I think you're absolutely onto something there. Okay, and then
it goes without saying, all this is making an assumption that our caseloads don't explode in September. I mean, fair enough. I mean, that's, I mean, who knows, but I mean, you can read the, yeah, I mean, okay.
Yeah. Sure. And if it did, we'd have to adjust.
Yeah, okay.
But yes. And so then we finally have an operations position that we're proposing. And we're proposing adding an additional custodian. We have an identified need for additional staff at Thurston. We're just realizing it's just a big building, and it's an old building, and there are a lot of needs there. And then we would use the remaining 0.5 FTE to cover custodial absences and leaves at other buildings. And basically what we've been doing over the last couple of years is really trying to assess how we're using overtime in our operations department. And we're trying to reduce the reliance on overtime, which actually we've made some real progress. And we think this would be another step in that. And it goes without saying that we think that, cleaning and disinfecting is going to continue to be a very high priority next year as students are returning to school. So just quickly, the non-salary changes. I'm going to have Allison to say a word or two about these.
Great. So we've put in for some additional funding in the project-based learning line, and we're really thinking about getting J-term back up and running. As you might recall, we had some very generous grant funding that helped us get the J-term program started over the first 2 years. We added funding about $15,000 in the operating budget in the first year, another 10 in the second year. This would bring our total to about $35,000 altogether. And to be honest, we've been running J-term at more than that, but we think that that is a sort of reasonable target for really keeping the program sustainable, and that we can kind of work within that. So that's what we're going to try and do. So that's the J-term cost increase. This next one's about software subscriptions, and honestly, the bulk of that $25,000 would be around investing in either expanding an existing program like STAR, which we've rolled out at the middle school into elementary grades, or finding a comparable program at the elementary grades that allows for screening and sort of quick, efficient, ongoing assessment of student learning. The idea is really we want a way to be able to see really clearly the impact of what's happened in the last year, so that we can respond quickly in intervention terms. We think a little bit of this may go also towards some price increases in some very popular current subscription-based services that we think are really useful. So IXL is probably the fan favorite out there, Newsella. All of these companies have had their boom time this last year, but that doesn't seem to be resulting in them keeping their prices down for us, unfortunately. And then thirdly, this is a really interesting proposal coming out of the high school to basically provide a kind of summer academy program for identified students coming from 8th grade into 9th grade who might need additional academic support in order to have a really great start to their high school experience. We've actually had kind of different iterations of this in the past, but given, again, the year that we've had and some preliminary data that people are looking at, the middle school and high school teams have already started talking, and based on some classroom data and our first round of STAR assessment data, they really think this is going to be a helpful support for kids. We want them to have a really great first kind of term at the high school.
Allison, I just had a question on the J term. So that
yes,
it's expected to continue on. And,
yes.
And I know in the past they've done some tremendous evaluations of the J term. What did the kids learn? What did they like, and all of that? Is some of those evaluations available? Because I just think it was an amazing thing, that whole program, on how they came up with new ones. I think there's a lot, and you think the funding is not going to be available in the future for that, or we've already?
Well, I think we're trying to sort of reduce our reliance on grant funding and grant writing, so that we can just sort of sustain the program within the context of the operating budget.
What about the student independent study project? Is that still moving?
That's a great question. I think we do not have it slated to be in its past format, but there's some really interesting conversation happening about sort of changing format for that program in the future. Emily might have a little more inside information, or Amy Davenport.
I do actually. So when we talked about the 1.0 FTE reduction in high school electives, actually a portion of that has to do with FTE that had been allocated to SIP. SIP didn't run this year, interestingly. But what we're going to try to, and that was driven by student interest, we're going to try to really revitalize that, but in a new form. And so Amy Davenport is looking to move it into the summer so that we would offer students the opportunity to have sort of a concentrated SIP experience over the summer. And we would offer a stipend to the teacher to run it as a summer program. So that's the model that we're looking at.
So there was no student interest in it. Is that what you said?
There wasn't enough to get it off the ground this year, but we think there is interest. We're just looking for the right, we're looking for the right model to make it work for kids. So we're going to give it another try.
I think when the kids did some evaluations of what they learned in it and what they did, I mean, that kind of information, I think, very valuable in marketing it and selling it to other kids. You know, I just don't know how much we did. We did so much evaluation of the J term, which was incredibly valuable, but I think there's some tremendous experiences in that SIP program if kids just knew about the opportunities.
Yeah, I agree. And so we're going to try to make sure that those opportunities are available. And we'll see. Who knows? Maybe after we move to the summer model, either will be a tremendous success, or we'll decide we want to, go back to how we had done it previously. So some non-salary changes just quickly. So we're expecting an increase in regular transportation. This is reflective of our contractual increases. We're in the 5th year of a 5-year contract with our bus company. The increase is also because we've rebalanced the transportation budget to adjust for offsets from other funding sources like kindergarten tuition that are no longer available to offset that line. And then we're looking to increase $50,000 in operations for things like PPE and sanitizing supplies. So, we really thought about this a lot, and we're assuming that there will be the need for continued use of PPE for the electrostatic disinfection. We want to be able to, continue to change our HVAC filters on a quarterly basis. And so we know there's going to be that need. Having said that, we budgeted pretty modestly for this. We've looked at our existing inventory of PPE, thought about what seemed reasonable. We know that, who knows how things are going to shape up next year, and we could end up with costs that are more than $50,000 in this area. But rather than increase the operating budget more significantly, we think that if we still are in this kind of milieu, then there likely might be some future state or federal funding, and we could use it for those kinds of COVID expenses, or we would have to go to other mitigation measures, like maybe considering using some of our mitigation funds. Okay. So moving on, a couple thoughts about special education. Should I pause and see if there's any other questions about Gen Ed? Keep rolling. Okay. So Abby.
So as folks know, we continue to provide really robust special education services in the district, and about 18% of our students do receive those services currently. The good news, I think, is that the vast majority of those students are served here in Westwood, and that's a really important reflection of our values, as well, I think, as the intention and investment of the district over many years to build programming that allows that to happen. So we have factored in the increased tuition cost, which does increase annually, as well as our anticipated tuition placements in this year's projected budget. So we frequently receive funds from a variety of sources for special education, and you folks are already familiar with this, but just to recap, we receive town funds as well as federal grants, most specifically the IDEA grant, And then we have the circuit breaker offset. And what's just important to know about that is that it is in arrears and that it's a reimbursement mechanism for the cost of very high cost services. However, it's paid a year after the services occur. So our primary focus this year has really been around maintaining our current programming and service levels, responding to our legal and regulatory responsibilities, which continue to evolve, and most importantly, increasing the mental health supports, specifically during this next year's period of recovery from the COVID impacts. So we have a request in the budget for a specific increase of $85,000 to contract services. And contract services is a really important line that is used for the purchase of highly specialized services and consultation for things that we don't employ specific employees for. So a really classic example would be the teaching of Braille. So this line has been used particularly this year for staffing flexibility. We've been able to staff up and to ramp down staffing for very particular needs using the contract service line. So we do anticipate that there'll be an increased need for these kind of services next year as part of our COVID recovery and stabilization. And I just want to say that the parents in Westwood have been very, very supportive and trusting of the school district in this area. And we are working very hard to provide the appropriate services. And we want to plan thoughtfully for next year to make sure we're able to do that. And then finally, this line, which we call contract services, has been historically underfunded. And we did a multi-year look back on that. And it's just been one of the lines that over the years we have not been able to fund at a level we wish we could. So our hope is that this year, the $85,000 could be added to the budget, and we would consider this as part of a structured rebuild of this line, similar to what the kindergarten offset project looked like. And we would look at this as a 4-year potential investment in rebuilding this line over time.
So I don't know if this question for you, Abby, for Lemma, because I want to understand the account here. Because so in theory, if we've been spending, let's say $500,000 a year, which is what the book said, on these costs and been funding at $200,000, it means there's other line items in the budget that we've been over, we budgeting over for and underspending. So my question is, my question is, what's happened to those items? Does that make sense? Because it's kind of like this is a accounting issue. So there's other items, have we adjusted those?
Right.
Could we take cuts there? I mean, one of the things I would say is that while that is true, that one of the things that I observed in coming into Westwood is that we had this structural deficit driven by lines like contracted services and special ed, but we were absorbing some of the costs in revolving accounts, which isn't ideal. So we had used that more than what was budgeted for, so in slight ways, but over time, that's a bad practice. So whereas some of the costs, I would say in overages are absorbed by savings in other lines that we realize. It could be turnover as an example. So there might be turnover and that might help us absorb an overage in long-term subs, for example, or there might be a reduction of expense somewhere in utilities and that might help us pay for an overage in the contracted services line. But I also in net observed, for example, in closing FY19, that we had just, even prior to my arrival, used the revolving accounts more than what we had budgeted for. And I don't think that that's a good practice.
No, I understand the practice. So I don't disagree with the practice. My point is that in theory, like if you use turnover, that's going to be another $85,000 actually we have next, in theory, assuming everything stays the same, it's going to be another $85,000 that we have next year to spend. If you keep the budget the same. I'm not saying this is a bad practice to get that to match. That's my point.
Yeah. No, I do understand the question. And I think that this 85K increase, so it's twofold, right? I mean, we do actually think we're going to have an increase in the needs for some of these services, right? So that's the first thing. And then secondly, we just want to go through a process of trying to get that line item to be what we think it really should be. And I would sort of add on to what Lemma has said, and that is that, you know, we also have had to do things like go to the special education reserve account. And, you know, we ideally just want to budget for what we think really we're spending over time. So that's how we're thinking of it. And, you know, we don't want to be sort of in a situation that's like uncertain and volatile where we're having to rely on reserves. We want to try to have a real understanding of what the expenses are and budget that way.
Yeah, but I guess my point is those reserves came from somewhere. So we couldn't be running a structural deficit of $300,000 a year in this. We'd be bankrupt. Yeah. I guess anyway, that's my point.
No, I understand your point, and I mean I think that the answer is partly like turnover, right? So we're sort of we're plugging holes with turnover. Where as we get farther into the year, you know, in April, saying we're freezing different accounts so that we can make sure that we close out the year.
Okay.
And yeah, clearly we balanced the budget. I agree with that premise. So I just think it's something that we need to take a look at, and it's something that we had foreshadowed. We talked about in a budget workshop we did a couple of years ago, and we think the time is right to turn our attention to it because we've gone through this 4-year process with kindergarten, and so we think there might be a little room for it to take a look at it at this point.
Abby, when we did a survey of parents back in the beginning of all this stuff, about a third of the parents said their kids were having social emotional problems and that they were looking for assistance and help. So I think we have kids who are IEP or special ed kids that have social emotional added problems because of this. Then we have kids that aren't special ed but also having problems that, you know, wouldn't be typically picked up in a program that's looking for this. And my question is, are there any issues out there that kind of group education, group intervention? Are there some common denominated issues where the kids that aren't usually looked at who are having problems that we can identify and through group interventions or education or specialists to come in and maybe help people with those problems, in addition to the tremendous work you do by narrowing it down to kids who are special ed kids. But I think there's a lot of people and probably a lot of teachers that wouldn't mind some assistance at this time too.
Yeah, absolutely, Charlie. And I appreciate you asking that. I think, you know, I anticipate that next year we'll have needs for many students, regardless of what their designation is, around stress and anxiety and the adjustment back to a full 5 days of school, and the load and the routine that comes with that. So I anticipate that as a whole, this budget proposal is intended to build in supports for all of those things that you mentioned. So by supporting the school psychologists and allowing some of that additional FTE to take over some testing, we free up other people who are known to families and kids who are in general ed to get assistance. And I love, you know, group supports, I think, are wonderful. So yep, we've thought a lot about that. And I believe that this budget builds in the supports that are appropriate for that. And I would be very open to keeping an eye on that as we start the year and revisiting what the needs are as we get to see kids back 5 days a week, which is going to be wonderful.
And so just the last slide here, we are planning for a 3% escalation for tuitions. The last slide of this section, I should clarify. We still got a ways to go. We're planning for a 3% escalation for tuitions and budgeting for anticipated placements. We've been pretty conservative on that, though. So we really, you know, we've taken a look at known placements. We don't have a big padding in the tuition line item if we have new referrals. And we've done that intentionally. We think that the balances in the special ed reserve accounts right now are ample. And so we chose not to increase the operating budget and plan to respond flexibly if we need to. The budget also builds for known increases in transportation related to special education.
Emily, I'm always interested in the tuition issue. Back from the day when we decided we're one of the few school systems with charging kids for kindergarten, you know, and we did a survey of what other towns do. Is there any way to get an idea of where do we stand regarding tuitions? Are we average, below average, above average? Because I think that's a sensitive issue to people.
Oh, let me clarify. I think I wasn't clear on what we mean here. These are tuitions that we pay for students who are in out of district special education placements. So we're not charging tuition. These are tuitions that we're paying. And actually on that front, we're very proud that we're able to accommodate most of our students in our in-district programs, which is in keeping with our values and cost effective. And so less than 1% of our students are in out of district placements, but we pay for them to go to those placements.
Thank you.
Okay, so finally on the operating budget, just looking sort of beyond FY22. And, I'm choosing to frame this a little differently than in past years. In past years, we used to sort of talk about what needs have gone unmet and, what's on the cutting room floor. And this year, we're really thinking about what are the priorities that we anticipate in upcoming budget cycles? What do we think is on the horizon? And so we anticipate that we're going to need in the near future to increase our English language learner staff. And, that has to do with the number of kids that we're serving, but also some changes in regulatory requirements around those services. We had in the FY21 budget a 0.4 FTE director of safety and security. And we had talked about we actually last spring were going ahead and starting that process. We had done the resume screen right when the closure happened. And so ultimately that position was not filled. As we talked about it, while we do think that this is a priority in the near future, we've recommended in this budget to reduce that 0.4 FTE out of the budget. We think that there are other priorities. Having said that, I think this is the kind of position that if you don't have it in place on September 1, that's okay. There's some flexibility. And, so we could certainly see where we are with turnover next year, and maybe halfway through the year, we would decide that we wanted to see about hiring that position. Thirdly, we've talked for many years at school committee. I've been asked many times about the possibility of expanding Westwood's METCO program to the elementary level. And we think that this is something that we should be giving serious consideration in the near future. And so just as a frame of reference, there are 33 METCO member districts. And we are one of only 2 METCO member districts that doesn't begin programming in kindergarten. And it's actually my understanding that the other district has a plan to expand. So, this is something that we're really interested in doing for a lot of reasons. We think it really makes sense for kids. It's in keeping with the values of the district. And as I mentioned before, we think that in adding the academic support position at the high school and sort of carving out a redefined role for the METCO director, that it would be a good time to think about it. The other thing I would just say is that, the issue has to do, it's a resource issue, right? So we would need to know that we could receive probably at least 18 or more students into one of our elementary schools. And as we're looking at the class sizes right now, we think that that probably is possible at this point. And so we might kind of have a moment here that we could take a look at one of our schools and expand the program. Just to sort of be thinking about, and clearly this would need a much fuller discussion. METCO is a program that is funded, it's grant funded. We do receive funding from the state, and the grant is allocated on a per pupil basis. So when you expand your program, you also increase the funding. The primary expense would be an additional bus. And so that's a very concrete expense, and you sort of need to go through a process of expanding so that it's worth it, and you have the grant funds to pay for the bus. So we would just have to think about that. And the grant is in arrears. And so we would have to be prepared to make sort of a 1-year investment to get the expansion off the ground. And then we would see the corresponding funding coming in the following year.
Emily, I'd like to strongly support that. I attended the Metco banquet last year, and what was unique is they all were so thankful and supportive of this program. The only comment they had was, you know, when you've been through grades 1 through 5 and then have to leave your school system to go to Westwood grade 6, it's a very difficult transition. And being one of the 2 systems that don't have it, when they come in the 1st grade, they're making their friends by the 6th grade. So that was a comment that they made that I thought would be well worth following up on. And I'm sorry I didn't speak up on the safety and security issue. I know we've been through this for a while. In the last couple of weeks, as you begin to see things happening in Washington and the comments people are making on, it's kind of a crazy time. I feel like we ought to be serious about getting even some part-time advice, some part-time assistance, asking our friend Brian Kelly, who knows a lot of people in the business of security, I don't think we should pass on this. And I'd like to see us begin to, even if it's part-time advisors, because I think that's a crazy time. In addition to the pandemic, that the kids today do active shooting drills. They're still in the school system. I think that says something that we really need to spend a little bit more thinking time on this. And I'd prefer if we just seriously looked into it and get part-time help. And there may be a lot of volunteer people around who know a lot about this stuff who could advise us. But I'd like to have us reconsider spending some more time and attention on the security issue, which we did spend quite a bit of time on about 5 years ago.
Well,
yeah, I'd like to build on that if I could. And just a little history. I mean, I think a year and a half ago, or maybe it was 2 years ago, I lose track of time, like everyone, we commissioned that study. We did some initial, locks and some additional works. And then there was, if you look at we talked about it, the January 16th school committee last year, I think there was a lockdown that exposed some challenges in the high school. And that was really the impetus for this position, which, just to be clear, was not for a police officer or anything like this. This was something that really helped program manage, in my words, all the implementation steps that came out of that audit. And I just worry about losing momentum. And I know there's a lot of priorities. So what I'd actually suggest is, as opposed, we actually take Emily's point of having this be a position that starts January 1, which would, I think, reduce the cost from $40,000 to $20,000, but we actually put that in the budget. So it's actually a commitment, not something for turnover, but something that we are committed to as in the budget. So we can reduce the cost, but I think $20,000 in a $50 million budget, that's 1/40th of 1%, which is pretty small. So that would be kind of my suggestion. I'd like to see maybe look into between now and the next meeting.
Sure, we can do that. Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Tony. We had envisioned this as the person who would oversee the implementation of that security audit. And I do want to emphasize that we've continued in our capital projects to chip away at implementing those recommendations. So we are doing that work, but I think it is that big picture thinking, someone who's going to be overseeing it, and it would be very helpful. So
can I make a point along those lines or a comment? I wasn't obviously part of the school committee when you went through the security audit, so I'd love to get a review or learn more about it. But I absolutely would support, a project management type role just to oversee that, not necessarily, a law enforcement officer in the buildings. That's not something that I would necessarily be in favor of. But I think in terms of like school safety and preventing shootings, whether it's, children harming themselves or others, the focus there really, I think, would be best served focusing on mental health. And that's where the psychologists and the social workers come into play. I think all the experts agree, and the research is pretty clear, that the more traumas children experience at a young age, the more the odds increase that they're going to hurt themselves or someone else. So I think our money would be well spent on mental health related to, safety and security.
I agree. You have to come at it from many angles. Yes. All right. So we will do that work for the next meeting. And then the last.
Can I?
Oh, sure.
One more thing on the Metco program.
Yes.
I know we talk about this in upcoming budget cycles, but I think I'd like to be a little more specific for this one if we can. I'm worried this will follow along to Josepha's foreign language push.
Mhm.
And I don't want, I think this is really important. And I think that it benefits everybody. So if we can kind of have a serious discussion, maybe at the school committee level, sooner rather than later, or at some point, just to make sure that this isn't one of those things that we keep putting on a list. And
I agree. I think we should talk about it this spring. And, to be clear, as we've been talking about it internally, we would like to see if it's possible for the FY23 budget.
mm-hmm.
So we would basically take next year as a planning year, because, this is a big deal and we would want to do it right. We would owe it to students to do it right. And we think it would give us next year to kind of, stabilize and recover from the pandemic, and then potentially expand the following year.
Okay, good. Okay.
Obviously that's, for further discussion, but that's what we've been talking about internally.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, and then our last one is just to create an additional preschool classroom. And I would just say that we think we could use additional capacity in our preschool. There are particular ratios. So our preschool is the Westwood Integrated Preschool. It's our program for providing special education services for young learners. There are ratios with students on IEPs and students not on IEPs. And we just, we feel that by the second half of the year, each year, we wish we had more capacity in our preschool program. So we would really need to take a look at some space issues and think about how to go about it, but it's on the horizon.
But is it something you'd have to add capacity in because of the IEPs, or is it something you want to add capacity on?
Well, so we're in a situation where, unfortunately, almost every year by the second half of the year, we're applying for a waiver to DESE.
Okay.
And so, that's not really the spirit of things to apply for the same waiver year after year.
Okay.
And so, we think we need to make that adjustment.
Okay, I understand.
Yeah. All right, so that's the operating budget, and then we're going to switch to capital, but let me just pause to see if there's anything else people want to talk about in operating. Okay, all right, well, then I'm going to turn it over to Lemma for some capital. And actually, I'm going to preface this by saying that, historically, the capital budget presentation was sort of one summary slide that looks like this. And last year, we said, we should provide more detail on that, which we have again this year. What occurs to me is that we probably also need to include this kind of detail in the budget book. And so we'll make that adjustment. The book has historically only been operating budget, but I think we should include capital in the future in the book. So with that, Lemma, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. So this famous slide does two things, both the look back at how we funded capital in the past 5 years and gives you a breakdown of how we would propose funding capital projects in FY22. And noteworthy on this slide, if we click forward, you'll see in FY19 and FY20, the total amount that was allocated jumped. So the town made a strategic and very intentional decision to increase the investment in capital in order to assist us in catching up on deferred maintenance in our buildings and to invest in FF&E and equipment that we needed in the schools. So that jump, luckily, we've been able to, we benefited from the fact that we've been able to sustain that. And in FY22, we're hoping to have the same level of funding that we had last year. We've distributed it in slightly different ways. So Emily, if you click, I've highlighted a couple of lines here. You'll see that there's a small change in HVAC. There's a little bit of an increase here of almost 25,000, and nod to the fact that we've always spent every penny of our HVAC funding. And in the pandemic, obviously there's been a lot more attention and need for us to keep up with our HVAC maintenance projects. So we're upping that line a little bit. The other strategic move here is to continue to fund the vehicles line. We don't always have vehicle expenses, but in this particular year in FY22, I am proposing another 50,000 to be set aside for vehicles for the operations department because we had several vehicles that were aging. So I'll give you more detail on that soon. The rest of the lines are roughly in line with where they've been. So not many changes here. So some highlighted projects for FY22. These are some examples of capital projects that would be prioritized this summer. We do a lot of our work in the summer. So the high school, the second floor and the preschool need some floor replacements. So some of the floors started peeling here and it's wear and tear after 15 years of use. We also have a glycol project, which is a fluid that we inject in the HVAC system to protect the system and the chiller. We have scheduled HVAC duct cleaning at Martha Jones and Downey. So that is also a summer priority, as well as some middle school floor repairs to the elevator loading area. So these are like just a series of projects we've identified that are high priority for us this summer. There are security projects that we're scheduling this spring, but anything that we cannot complete during school vacation weeks or during the spring would be pushed to the summer. So that's with existing, you may recall that we had 150K in security funding at the prior town meeting. And so that continues to go on. And if there's anything there that's critical that isn't funded in that allocation, we will be using some of our capital allocation here to complete those projects. And then there is a proposed maintenance shed project with the recreation department. We're waiting to see if they're going to proceed with this, but we've made a commitment to partner with them because we need the storage space. There are AC installations sometimes that are requested by schools, and we will be deferring to the student services department to make recommendations on buildings where we need them based on student needs. And then finally, there's just a slew of bathroom restorations, paving projects. These are small things across a scattering of projects across all of the district. The total cost is approximately 500 to 600K. And this would hit our building repair lines as well as the HVAC lines. So that's projects. There are some projects that we may intentionally defer, especially, unless other projects come in under budget. This is wider district-wide paving, basketball courts at Downey. There's also Sheehan basketball court. Some more, there's always a desire for AC, so some of that will be deferred. We will prioritize what student services recommends. We will defer the Martha Jones roof repairs. I don't foresee doing them this summer, but I want to flag that and say that we're updating our assessment of the roof condition at the Martha Jones and the Sheehan, and we're ready to proceed with the repairs if urgent repairs are needed. So,
Lemma, is there, for things like the Downey basketball court or the Sheehan basketball court, is there any discussions with the PTOs and saying, this could be a PTO fundraiser project? I don't know how much that costs. Maybe it's too much for a PTO, but things like that. It just seems to me that I know PTOs are always looking for projects and ways to give back to the school. And I don't know if we're deferring it, it's just an idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we got to a place where we thought we were close, maybe that might make more sense. They are expensive projects. The Downey courts, the last time it was quoted was in the range of 50,000.
Okay,
so small.
It's probably too much for a PTO to raise.
We're not quite there. So these are the highlights. And then we have I just wanted to note some technology purchases that we'll be making. We made a very big investment in technology this year, and we're very proud of what we've been able to do to allow our students to learn remotely and to leverage the tools that are available on the market. But there are some more scheduled investments. One of them is the scheduled replacement of Chromebooks for grades 6 and 9. So that's part of our long-term capital plan, and we will be investing about 120K into that in FY22. And then we're proposing a secondary firewall. This is both for network protection and also to allow our students to remotely access course-specific resources that may not be on their Chromebooks and may not be accessible from home. This is in engineering, graphic design, and video production. And I've noted here that the vehicle that we are proposing is proposing to replace is a 2006 Ford van that's just reached its useful life. So that's the proposal for that 50K investment in vehicles. Let's see what else we got.
Let me pause and ask if there are any questions about this for Lemma because we have one last topic
Yeah, so one question, I know in some past years, the town has been very supportive through some additional capital funds. Like I think they supported the Thurston HVAC as an example. Do we have any sense? Are there any projects like that on the horizon and or funds that you've talked about through budget steering?
I mean, maybe that is what's coming up in the next section, but now that you bring up the HVAC project at Thurston, I just wanted to say, one of the highlights in the last 2 weeks is that we were able to complete the final Univent installations.
Okay.
And so that project is now basically wrapped up. There are some loose ends we just have to tie up there, including making some repairs to the place where the installation happened. So patching walls and that sort of thing. But it's a big triumph because this has been a multi-year project, and I want to give a shout out to Ken for leading it in the process.
Yeah.
Great.
So, and Tony, I don't think that we have put any major project on that article, but I will note that one of the projects that's on there is the replacement of the multi-purpose field, which is clearly, something that we benefit from. And so that's a big project that will be up for discussion there.
Yep. I mean, the next section highlights some longer term capital considerations, and those might end up being like separate capital articles. So we can transition to that.
So, I'm going to jump in here. I want to talk a little bit about elementary buildings in the context of long-term capital. And so I've put up here a timeline. This is a timeline that the school committee is very familiar with, right? But we've been talking about what is now the Hanlon-Deerfield project since the master plan and capital needs study the school committee commissioned back in 2015. And as you are well aware, we have been invited into the Massachusetts School Building Authority's program, which provides some funding for local communities to replace aging buildings. And so where we are here in the process is over in the green, where we have been engaged now since the fall of 2019 in the feasibility study, making a decision about the scope of the project and schematic design. I actually should back up here just to remind people that in order to work with the MSBA, communities submit for one particular building. And coming out of that master plan and capital needs study, the district determined that Hanlon was the building that we would apply with. We were accepted into the program for Hanlon, but after we were accepted in, the school department, the district, and the town met with the MSBA, and we worked with them to see if we could use this partial reimbursement opportunity to solve for 2 schools instead of 1 school. And so that was how we were able to basically to get the MSBA to agree to invest in a bigger project. And that, is what we were studying throughout the feasibility study to determine what that might look like. We did see if we could get them on board to do a project that would solve for all 3 schools, but that was beyond what we were able to work out with the MSBA. So we have this tremendous opportunity right now, and we can talk more fully about it in other contexts. But I put this up here tonight to say that we obviously have very significant capital needs at Hanlon and Deerfield. And right now, the capital improvement plan for Hanlon and Deerfield is this project, right? This is the solution to those needs. And so on the assumption that this is the plan and that it's going forward, that's the frame of reference when we think about what kind of maintenance projects we'll be doing at Hanlon and Deerfield in the short term. So Lemma, I don't know if you want to jump in here and just say a few words about what you're thinking about here.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I've listed some projects that will proceed on schedule at the Hanlon and Deerfield schools because I want to acknowledge that we're going to be maintaining these buildings. We've got students in them, and they remain a high priority for us. So, but there are some that are immediately on my radar, and there will always be new projects that pop up. Right now, some door crash bar replacements at the Deerfield, some plumbing and bathroom repairs at both schools, siding replacement in limited areas at the Hanlon, and some security upgrades at both of the schools. These are already on our radar. There are some projects that may not need to be funded if this the school project is approved. And Examples of those are also listed here, including floor replacements, like a more major plumbing replacement at Hanlon, which we haven't even been able to achieve anyway, because no one bid on it. And then aesthetic improvements in those buildings. So we would defer those.
The big picture here is that our plan is to do, the minimum maintenance required to keep the buildings going, with the understanding that we would make a major investment in a new building and therefore not be making some of these other bigger capital investments. We're similarly thinking about Sheehan, and so this is obviously in a different phase of discussion than the Hanlon Deerfield project. But we have talked at school committee about this before. And so I just want to remind folks that last February 2020, the school committee did allocate $30,000 for a high-level design study of what we said at the time was the remainder school. And that's because at the time we were involved in the feasibility study and we weren't sure what the consolidation plan was going to be. So we now know that the plan is to consolidate Hanlon and Deerfield, which still leaves Sheehan as a building that we need to address. So we have commissioned that high-level design study, and beginning this spring, very soon, we as a committee will need to review the design study results and the project options and engage in the community in some discussion, and ultimately determine what we think is the best way forward for Sheehan. And it's sort of a similar process to what we looked at with Hanlon. You can do everything from base repair to a full renovation to build a new school. And so as we think about what would the potential timeline for a project like this be, we've mapped out a timeline in consultation with designers, because this is the timeline that we think that we could manage as a school department, right? And the idea here would be that we would go to the town in spring 2023 to ask for design funding through bidding. And then that would target a fall 2024 town vote for full project funding. And that would enable occupancy in September 2026. So obviously we're at the beginning stages of this conversation, but I'm putting this out here because this is always running in the background for us when we're thinking about what kinds of capital improvement projects we need to do, what our maintenance plan is. This is, important context for us. So, we have previously commissioned a study that told us that a comprehensive base repair of Sheehan, so that's just sort of bringing things in line, adjusting for code and fixing things with the systems and whatnot, would cost $29 million just for the base repair. So that doesn't allow you to make changes to think about the education program, to think about the configuration of the building, all of those things that we did in the visioning process with Hanlon and Deerfield. So what we're thinking about now is that until base repair or renovation or a new building can be completed at Sheehan, we will have to continue to fund priority maintenance projects. And we've looked at this very closely. And Lemma, you're probably better suited to talk about this than I am. So.
No problem. So yeah, there's a list of projects that we have identified through our knowledge of the building as well as consultation with architects. And first up here as a priority is the installation of 21 new univents for more efficient and consistent heat. This is with the understanding that with the building occupied for another 5 to 7 years, this is just a real high priority for comfort and instruction in the building. Roof replacement here. There are some sections that are over 20 years old and are recommended for replacement, and the cost at last estimate, which was in 2019, was $416K. We have budgeted in this list for replacement of 10 large windows. This is near the art classroom and on that wing of the building, and the cost is $39K. There are stair treads and floor repairs and roughly $20K. There has been a request for 47 AC units for the classrooms that get the most hot on summer days or early fall days. And if we go all the way here, we'll need a potential electric panel upgrade. So the cost could be as high as 115. We could keep it to 60. So there's a range on this one. And there are some security improvements for 25K. So that's really the list of the top priority projects after speaking to the principal. And I'm sorry, I missed the lighting, but lighting at the Sheehan, I want to acknowledge, is a project that could be funded partially by the Green Communities Grant or through incentives with Eversource. So we're looking into that opportunity as well. The total is about 1.8 million. We think that this would ensure a safe and comfortable use of the building for a period of 5 to 7 years, pending whatever permanent solution is determined by the town.
So I think the point that we're trying to make here is that, there needs to be a comprehensive solution for Sheehan. And we're thinking about what that timeline is, but we're planning very carefully to say, what do we know that we're going to need to do in the meantime in order to kind of keep Sheehan going? And we don't need to get into sort of all the nitty gritty of these bullets, tonight. But we just want to say we probably need to have a larger conversation at some point that certain renovations may trigger a requirement to complete the comprehensive base repair. And it has to do with these rules around the valuation of the building and the square footage. And you can see all sort of these if-then statements here. And so when we're thinking about how to approach kind of keeping Sheehan going as we reach a decision about what the long-term solution is, we just have to be mindful about these things because at some point it isn't sustainable to just kind of keep doing little, for lack of a better word, Band-Aid projects. At some point you end up sort of tripping over into this next zone, and then you really do have to, think about a more serious comprehensive base repair. So, we want to think very strategically about how we approach this going forward. And I would just editorialize here that as the superintendent, I, of course, would very much hope that we would be talking about if we're going to make a very significant investment in Sheehan, which I think we will need to do, making sure that that investment considers the educational needs and the parity of the schools in the district, and making a choice that's going to be a good investment for the long term for kids' education in Westwood.
So I don't want to go too down, but I guess Mayor or Emily. So I'm just trying to understand the timing of these conversations. So we're getting these design in a few months. We'll get some options. There's some other stuff here. I guess when, and I know, and we obviously have the fall, which we need to talk about Hamlin. I guess trying to understand what we need or what your anticipation is over between now and say the fall. The fall on this.
Yeah. So May, I don't know if you want to speak to that, or if you would
Sure.
like me to.
I mean, the timing of this is going to be purely up to the school committee.
Okay.
We haven't submitted a statement of interest to the MSBA. We certainly could, but as I've said before, even pre-COVID, it would not be very likely that we would be approved, given that our current project at the time probably wouldn't have even broken ground. Or if it has broken ground, it's still under construction. And post-COVID, the MSBA relies on sales tax for its funding, and I think that has taken a big hit. So I think they are very, very conscious of spreading the wealth among the communities throughout the Commonwealth. I just think that it would be unrealistic for us to assume that we would be accepted into the MSBA project. So if we do a statement of interest, or if we don't, and for some, if the MSBA is not part of this, then it's a school committee project, and we would determine timing. We would determine when we want to do it. To Emily's point, I think that these repairs that we're looking at, these capital repairs to Sheehan, will take us about 5 to 7 years. After that, we have to look at these more significant costs to keep Sheehan going. I mean, at this point, Sheehan is about 70 years old. And, the typical life expectancy, if you will, of a building it's either there or we're past it. And it's valued at $20 million. The base repair is $29 million. So the school committee, should think about that when making a decision. this projected timeline is one that we came up with the designers, because from my perspective, I know that there's discussion about other municipal projects in town, but from my perspective as a school committee member, I'm advocating for schools. And, I think that the Sheehan project is a very important project to the town. So this to me is a comfortable timeline. It has, we don't ask for any money at all until spring of 2023, which is actually a few months. No, sorry, it's not. We will have not completed.
Well, by the time we would go fall 2024 on this timeline, by the time that we'd be going to residents to fund the Sheehan project, we
will be open.
Hanlon Deerfield would be open.
Right. And breaking it up like this, spring 2023 design funding through bidding, that's a much, much smaller percentage of the overall cost. I mean, it's probably around the 5 million as opposed to, the 55 million for the school or whatever. I mean, I'm literally making up numbers here, but it's a small percentage. So we would do it more in chunks. And then in fall 2024, the full project funding, that would be for the construction costs. So I do think this is a realistic timeframe. I think September 2026 is about 2.5 years after Hanlon opens. So for me, I would advocate for this schedule, but as I said, it's up to the school committee because it will be a school committee project. There's no, we don't have this concept of a feasibility phase or schematic design. We certainly could use the MSBA model. I think it's been very successful. I think it's forced us to do a lot of analysis and really, really be very strategic and considerate about the decisions we make. So we certainly could look at the aspects of that program that we like and use it. And the MSBA has actually said to me they'd be willing to, sort of talk us through that if we wanted to, or direct us to other communities that have done that have sort of taken the MSB model and adapted it for their own. But it would be this to me is a comfortable time frame.
So this obviously is a much bigger discussion. I just raise it tonight to say that as we're thinking about sort of annual capital needs and thinking about, those issues, we are thinking about kind of this time frame, and we're really thinking about what kind of investment would we need to make in Sheehan in the meantime. Having said that, the first order of business is absolutely to successfully shepherd the Hanlon Deerfield project. Goes without saying, it is just an unbelievably wonderful opportunity to get some very significant funding from the state and to solve our facility needs in 2 elementary schools through this project. And so that really needs to happen if we are to even contemplate talking about the next project for Sheehan. So we'll be talking a lot more about that over the next few months.
So just so I'm clear, Emily, if the Hanlon Deerfield product doesn't pass, or maybe Maya, whomever, then it would push the Sheehan project back significantly, right? Because we'd still have to kind of go back to square one and address the Hanlon Deerfield needs and then address the Sheehan needs after that. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult for me, Amanda, to even contemplate that scenario. I have to be honest. But it would be a full regroup at that point, because just like we have an estimate of 29 million for a base repair for Sheehan, the combined base repair for Hanlon and Deerfield is, I think, 41 million. I'd have to go back and check.
It's 41 million.
Yeah, and so to not take this opportunity to work with the state to get a brand new building for Hanlon and Deerfield would be,
tragic.
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 Yeah, silly doesn't capture it. It would be tragic.
Well, it would be tragic because doing nothing is not an option.
No.
And I think that has been the mantra all along. We cannot just sit and watch. And these Band-Aids that you've talked about will get us through a few years. But doing nothing is not an option. And if this doesn't pass, then we're throwing away money that would come to us. So, but this is obviously all conversation for another day. And we'll continue with this the budget. And yes, we should schedule some time, of course, too, to talk about the Sheehan School, but all good points.
Yeah. So wrapping it up here, just how does our budget landscape compare? We just want to again say that we feel good that we've weathered the pandemic from a budgetary perspective, and to thank the town for their support in that. It has been a really wonderful collaboration. We think our staffing cuts were limited to sustainable levels, and we have not had to go back to the voters to supplement the operating budget in FY21 from town funds, which we do know has happened in some other communities. We like to put this up each year just to look at how our per pupil spending compares. And so this comp group is Boston Magazine's top 25 high schools for 2020. So I don't know if that's a legitimate comp group, but it seemed like a good one to look at here. And, when we look at our per pupil spending, you can see Westwood here is the green star. And the red dot there represents the state average. And, I think that we're in good company where we are. We kind of like to be on this slide, not towards the top on this one. And Westwood's per pupil spending comes in at right about the median in this comp group. So next steps, we will be presenting the operating budget, a more streamlined version of it, to FinCom next week on February 9th. The school department is meeting with the FinCom's education subcommittee. I put February 11th. I don't know that date is actually confirmed yet, but it's in the works. And then, of course, we have our regular school committee meeting on February 11th, which will also serve as the budget hearing for members of the public to provide feedback. The FinCom has budget hearings throughout the month of March, and then that leads us to the annual town meeting in May. So tonight we launched the process, and many more conversations to come. Let me stop sharing.
All right. Well done. Emily, Abby, Allison, Lemma, thank you for all of that information and all the hard work that you and your teams have put together. I have all the hard work that you've done on this to put together this budget. So as a school committee, we have a lot to consider. And as you know, we have next Thursday, we'll be coming together again, and that's for the public hearing, and the public will have opportunity to participate and so forth. But we're not there yet. First, we're done with our discussion items though for tonight. And unless anyone has some new business, is there any new business?
I just want to thank Emily and her staff and the teachers who last year decided to have no salary increase. And that was unbelievable at the town meeting out in the field. It really shook a lot of people up that how dedicated our staff and our teachers were. I'm not sure all the teachers, but I think that was a tremendous statement on your part at the time, at the beginning of the crazy time.
I'm going to clarify, Charlie, that actually it was actually administrators, principals, and my central office colleagues who gave back their increases, and some of our other bargaining units, the instructional assistants and our food service people, agreed to a 0% increase no increase for this year. And I appreciate your reminding me about that, because we really appreciate their willingness
It
to
was a tremendous
work with
statement.
us. It's great.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Fred. Thanks. I echo Carol's sentiments. Thanks for a really detailed and great presentation. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you.
Well, it was
Well
twice as
done.
long as I had been trying for, so
I know,
there's a reason we do a
right?
special meeting for this one.
That's right. It's a lot of time, and it deserves the attention.
Yeah.
So it, as I said at the beginning of the meeting, this is a huge part of what we do as a school committee. So we appreciate the time you all stayed, and it's part of our job as volunteer school committee members to really go through this budget carefully. So it was worth the time.
Right.
But at this point, we're all ready to go home, if you will. So I'll take a motion to adjourn.
Do we have a vote on the, sorry, I thought we had to vote on some minutes, or no?
No,
We don't have any minutes. We don't
Oh,
have any.
okay, sorry.
we put all the action items
You know
on.
what? I'll make a
you love
motion to
being with us.
adjourn.
He loves to be with all of us and tried to stretch the meeting out.
I'll second that.
Thank you. And I'm sure
Okay.
there's no discussion on adjournment, so I just do the roll call vote to adjourn. Charlie Donahue,
Yes.
Maya Plotkin,
Yes.
Amanda Phillips,
Yes.
Tony Mullen,
Yes.
and I agree, yes. Thank you all. We are adjourned. Have a great evening and a good weekend. Be safe.
Take care.
Thank you.
Good night.